It's a difficult subject, eating disorders. I mean, all mental health disorders are difficult, but it's particularly dangerous as a mental health issue in terms of mortality, of anything that a person can suffer with. The rate at which the level of destruction that it can cause is really, really high. Years ago, I spent some time working with people who had been diagnosed with anorexia and with bulimia, mainly women, mainly girls, a couple of guys as well. And it's one of these subjects that it upsets people. People get very easily triggered by it because it's so dangerous and so awful. And because any time that you discuss food and nutrition, people respond in a more primal and emotional way to it. So it can be seen as a kind of cheap view baiting or controversy baiting strategy. And so I just want to start by saying I'm not interested in that kind of thing at all. There have been inside of my own family and my own personal life people with eating disorders, and I've seen what it does to the person, what it can do to the people around them. Somebody who specializes in the subject sent me an email, and I thought it would be easier to reply this way and also to just share a couple of thoughts about it. She said that she saw a client who'd been for in a residential therapeutic setting to deal with the anorexia, and had come back and got the very strong impression that the anorexia was still very present, and that the person had simply learned to bullshit therapists, dietitians, doctors, so that she could carry on doing what it is that she felt compelled to do in the first place. The person reaching out to me, person who's working for the NHS currently, said it felt like they were still under the spell of a narcissistic inner voice. And so I felt, because of that particular framing, I felt inspired to make this short video. My observation and my understanding of what's happening there, there's a couple of, it's a controversial topic anyway, but a particularly controversial idea that I have never come out with publicly before, but I've observed, is the prevalence of highly narcissistic fathers with anorexic or bulimic daughters. That's not a particularly nice thing to say, and it's the kind of thing that will probably get me a kicking, but fuck it. I've seen that. I've seen it way too many times to ignore it. So how would this relate to CPTSD, to childhood trauma, and issues with the superego, particularly an internal voice that seems to be like a narcissistic abuser? It's very straightforward in its structure, but not, it's simple but not easy. So structurally, the child, be they male or female, is going to carry messages given to them from their parents and from the environment in the form of introjects throughout life. When we have a toxified superego, typically what this means is that So the superego is the part of the self that enforces values, that enforces morality. It is not good or bad in and of itself. It has a function, which is to enforce values. It's to enforce moral judgments. If let's gender this. So if a little girl is being raised by a cold and distant and judgmental father, and she's fighting for his love, and he breadcrumbs that love with little displays of validation, affection, acknowledgement when she excels or she does something to a very, very high level, it breeds in her, as it would in a little boy as well, perfectionism. So the superego internalizes a bunch of messages in the form of introjects, messages from the super meaning above, not like Superman, but super just meaning to be above the ego. You have the ego, that's you, that's your boundary between reality in you and between your emotions and your thoughts. That's a good, healthy, functioning ego. And then above the ego is a parental type figure, a judge type figure that says, thou shalt and thou shalt not. And I think what can happen over time is that that part of the self becomes toxic, because the way we love ourselves is a direct reflection of the way our parents love us. So if that love and that validation was extremely conditional and based on you must, thou shalt, in order to receive acknowledgement, in order to receive love, the child internalizes a perfectionistic part. So even if the father dies or moves away or the parents divorce and she never sees him again, she'll still carry that part of herself inside of her. The part will be cruel, violent, because make no mistake, eating disorders are violent. It's a violent, and especially, well, I've had a very close friend of mine and a girlfriend of mine. When it gets into its phases and the physical manifestations, the physical symptoms show up, it's really, really savage. It's bloody awful. I personally believe, and I think, I know that there is research or the opinions of proper clinicians, of which I am not one, I'm not a clinician. The opinions of people who are qualified match the idea that the perfectionism and sort of the violence and cruelty and lack of compassion with which that's leveraged will mirror that of the highly demanding parent. It can be manifesting, it typically manifests in little girls as it starts in childhood in young girls who then grow up into women, but they have the little girl inside of them. And it can happen with little boys who grow up into men who still have something inside of them, which, it can go the other way. More typically for men, it becomes vigorexia or bigorexia. It's still body dysmorphia. It's still perfectionism. It's not, I need to be the thinnest little boy in the room. It means, I need to be the most athletic or the most muscular little boy in the room, which can lead to issues with steroids and performance enhancing drugs and, I can't remember what it's called now. It comes from the word orthodoxy, where people become obsessed, super obsessed with clean eating, and they have like an orthodox way of eating. So it's an internalized part. It is CPTSD. I think the correct way, or the most high efficiency way of dealing with it, is to treat it as CPTSD and to treat the compulsions to restrict food as a response to the terror of the emotional flashbacks. It is terror. It is terror. In order to motivate the violence that is required and the restriction and the cruelty that's required for anorexia or bulimia, the person needs to be motivated by a strong emotion. And that strong emotion, I believe, is terror. It could be the terror of abandonment. It could be the terror of judgment. It could be the terror of being condemned as unlovable and unacceptable, but it is terror. So that is one of the primary things that needs to be dealt with, is the emotional flashback of the fear, the terror that's there. The terror of abandonment, the terror of condemnation, the terror of judgment. And then the other thing is to deal with this toxified superego in the way that we would handle any inner critic issues. So when people in psychology and counseling are talking about healing the inner critic or silencing the inner critic or whatever, they're really talking about trying to offer therapy for a toxified and extremely perfectionistic and demanding superego. So we have to deal with the emotional flashbacks, the terror, and realize that the mechanics of what's happening here. The person is terrified and they want to get back into control. The person is terrified and feels this like an abandonment of all their coordinates of reality, like they're going to be consumed by nothingness, and that this one thing that they can do controls the somatic space. So whilst they can't control the emotional space, they can leverage a savage level of control, which mirrors the superego, which mirrors the perfectionistic, emotionally violent parents or not. It might not be the parents. It could come from an institution. It could come from maybe from a relationship, but the person would still need to be quite young when that relationship took place, and the relationship would have to be, pretty awful, pretty all-consuming. They'd have to have lived in what would essentially like a prison type of scenario, which can happen, So it's dealing with the emotional flashbacks. It's dealing with the inner critic and realizing that, that, yeah, it can be like the person is carrying a narcissistic abuser inside of their heads, who's gaslighting them, who's provoking them, who's insulting them, who's demeaning them, and who the person feels trauma bonded to please and appease under threat of pain, under threat of emotional suffering, the continuance of the emotional suffering and the pain. So that's how I think it should best be dealt with. And yes, of course, if the person thinks that the right way for them to live, it becomes a philosophical issue, I believe. It becomes a question of ethic. So everything that is to do with diet and health, actually, when people are looking to make changes, they've got to change their ethic. So it is a philosophy issue as well. It's a psychology issue when we're coming to mental health, getting the person emotionally re-regulated, dealing with the inner critic. But then beyond that, it's philosophical, because we've got to look at their ethic. What's your work ethic? What's your lifestyle ethic? Is this the right way to live? Have you become hyper competitive? Are you being compassionate? Are you being cruel? And asking that question: what's health? What is healthy? What is good? Is this the only way to get the job done? As with all forms of therapy and coaching, I believe it should always be done from inside the person's view of reality, not from outside. So no judgment, no condemnation for what that person is doing, to be looked at in a very dry, neutral and systematic way. So you feel this way, and your response is a strategy. Your strategy is this, and then when you fulfill the strategy, does it work? Well, yes, it does. It's the same as dealing with drug addicts. They can get slippery. Drug addicts can figure out how to get out of a residential scenario very quickly if they're of, average or above average intelligence. Of course, it's easy to figure out what a therapist wants you to hear or a counselor wants you to hear. So it's similar in that regard. But the reason why the ego, the person, will lie to get back to their way of doing things is because it works. It's because it works. If it stopped working, they'd give it up. But because it's still working, so the person who's doing the intervention needs to have the clarity of intent, the clarity of thought, and the empathy and the compassion to go, okay, this is still working for this person. They have an ethic, and I'm offering them a counter ethic. And if I haven't convinced them philosophically of the contrary ethic, we'll get bad results, temporary results, mixed results, or zero results. So there are my quick thoughts on that subject. Please keep all of the comments respectful, or I will just switch the comment section off. It's not a fucking kindergarten. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and your attention. And I'll be speaking to you later tonight when I go live. Thank you.